Bad stream audio got you down, burning your viewers.
Well, we've got the fix in OBS 29. Let's do it. Yeah! OBS Studio 29 is primarily a video-focused update. You have expanded frame rate options for capture cards, you've got AV1 support for Intel and AMD graphics cards, you got HEVC and ProRes encoders for macOS. I have a whole OBS 29 update video already shot and uploaded a month or so ago right here, so you can check that out if you're interested. But it did come with some audio features, one of which was more default audio support for capture cards, which was great, again, covered in the previous video. But the other is a couple new audio filters. The first is a 3-band EQ, which allows you to customize the flavor and the voice of your microphones to sound a little bit better. You could apply it to anything, not just microphones, but it's a basic EQ. 3 bands isn't great, but you can do some stuff with it. And the second is an upward compressor, which you'd primarily use to apply to your game sound or other background sound to reduce the dynamic range on the quiet side so your viewers can still hear it. We're gonna combine everything we've learned in my first 2 recent, perfect stream audio guides into one guide here and review the neat Microphones King B2 here, because this thing is amazing, and make the perfect stream audio using just the tools available built into OBS. We're not using Adobe Audition, we're not using VSTs even, we're just doing everything here. So I have the King B2, which is a large diaphragm condenser microphone from Neat Microphones. I previously reviewed their little Bumblebee USB mic. This is its bigger brother, and it is wonderful on my voice. You all have been giving me so many compliments for how the mic sounds on my voice in streams recently, which is wild. Nice little microphone, comes with the shock mount, which is rad. It doesn't look too offensive, and can just kind of sit here. It's pretty great. We're gonna just use everything built in. I do have it run into the Wave XLR audio interface, but we're not gonna use any of the processing settings available in Elgato's Wavelink software. We're just using OBS here. So I've already got my microphone selected in audio settings here. We have the mic in on Wave XLR. If you are using the Wave XLR and you apply effects into it, you wanna use the microphone effects option. We are not, we're just using the direct line in for now. So we're good to go. We got our audio levels here. I will reference my older guides a bit in saying that I do have a whole section dedicated to that, talking about gain staging, which is setting the gain on your microphone or your audio interface so that it actually comes into your computer pretty quiet, so you don't clip or peak even when you start shouting, but it, is clean enough that you get the levels that you need, and then we amp it up in post-production with our processing settings. So I have mine coming in pretty hot because of the way the Wave XLR handles things, but if you are following that video as well, you just have a much quieter audio setup here down here, where it would just show you kind of down here. I'll show the graphic on screen for where your levels should be. I explain it more in that video, but effectively, you want your microphone coming in at around like -12 as its peaks, and then gain it up later. I've already effectively done that gain staging in my interface, but if you wanted to do that, so for example, I can simulate this here real quick. So we can kind of simulate that here by just cranking down our gain in the Wavelink software. You can see here, at about -12. So we click the 3 dots in your audio mixer. If you don't see that, go to docks and make sure audio mixer is checked. If it's still vanished and you can't figure it out, you can reset your docks and it'll make it more look like this. We're gonna click the 3 dots, go to filters, and since our audio is way too quiet, we're gonna add a gain filter. Digital gain is clean. It won't add any hiss or noise or whatever that isn't already present in your signal. And we're just gonna crank it up until we're hitting about -2. That's fine. We're going to be adding in post-processing filters before it finally clips. That will keep it from clipping, but in this short moment here, we will be clipping a little bit. So again, we want that up in the -2, -5 range. Make sure we're not clipping a ton, but even if you do clip a little bit, like if I start shouting, I start clipping a little bit. That's fine, because this is clipping in software, and as we apply other filters, it will keep us from clipping in the final output. The next stage is to decide on your EQ and your compression. EQ is tuning the frequencies of your voice. This is used in 2 different possible ways. The first way is basically a recovery way of tuning frequencies that sound kind of gnarly in your microphone. For example, around the 250 hertz range is where you start to sound extra boomy and muddy, and it makes your voice not clear. Around the 3200 hertz range, you get a little bit of boxiness from like reverb in your room you might want to tame. Pretty much everyone needs to tone down the mids, either at around 800 or 1000 hertz, which helps with nasaliness and things like that. And so you could use it to subtract from your microphone to make it sound better, or you could use it to boost certain frequencies to add a little extra flavor for it. The typical chain for this is to EQ for recovery, then compress, and then EQ for adding that extra flavor if you want to do that. So that is the staging we will follow here. Otherwise, we're mostly matching my prior videos. I do also want to mention I have that first video on microphone technique. The way your microphone sounds completely different based on where you are positioned. For example, I have mine within about 4 to 6 inches of my mouth because it's a condenser microphone. It doesn't need to be right up on my mouth, but a dynamic microphone is going to need to be right up on your mic to really get the best sound out of it. And of course, I have it at an angle, so if I say pop, it's not plosiving or popping into the microphone without a shock mount. Those kinds of things are super important. Also, you're gonna get, if I back it up here up against my monitor so that it's off camera or something, and then I start talking even louder to get picked up into the microphone, you're gonna get a lot more reflections off of the monitors, and I'm gonna have to gain it up more, so you're gonna hear my PC more and things like that. All of these physical characteristics play a huge role in how your audio sounds that, take place outside of OBS, but are just as important because you can't fix really, really bad technique and really, really bad placement and things like that with settings pretty much at all. So we're going to come in here. We're going to add a 3-band equalizer. This is the new filter added in with OBS 29. Click OK. Actually, we're going to call this correction because that is the first stage we're doing. We're correcting our microphone, and it gives us 3 bands. High frequencies, which are, higher end stuff or hisses, things like that. Mid frequencies, which is going to be your nasaliness, a little bit of the bass, but a little bit of that boxy nasally sound. And low end, which is going to be the deeper, bassier registers of your voice. Now, in an ideal world, there would also be a high pass filter, which would cut off the super low end so you don't get too boomy for your viewers' ears. One step at a time with these filters being added. So in my case, because I have a deeper register, we are actually going to tone down low end just a tiny bit. If you don't have a deeper voice, you might get away with boosting this a little bit to add a little bit more warmth and oomph to your voice. But because we don't have a high pass filter engaged here, I kind of want to go ahead and do that so that it sounds, I don't blow people's eardrums out with bass because I get complaints about that if I don't keep that in check. Now I'm going to tone down mids because I am a very allergy-prone person. I have tons of congestion all the time. I end up sounding pretty nasally. A normal range to tweak these frequencies would be anywhere from 0, obviously, to -3 to -5. Once you go past -5, that's considered really pushing it. In some scenarios, you do want to do that. In my case, I'm just doing a little bit of correction here, cutting out those mids, cutting down a little bit of those lows. Actually, I'm gonna cut down a little bit of those lows so that we get a more flat, kind of clear signal. You're gonna have to use your ear for this. So the way to do this, since we are doing this with live streaming software, the way you're gonna have to figure out if this sounds good for you is to just do test recordings. Turn off the filters, record it, turn on the filters, record it, tweak until it sounds good for you. You could alternatively turn on audio monitoring in advanced audio properties here, monitor and output. If I turn that on, it's going to start looping back, but it's going to be on a delay, which is going to make it harder for you to hear and harder for you to hear the differences. Unfortunately, I got to turn it off or I can't talk right. Unfortunately, there's not a good, easy way to kind of loop it back and test these settings within OBS like there is in, say, the Beacon software. So for now, that is kind of what you have to do. And I do recommend if you find yourself getting frustrated or not being able to tell the differences anymore, take regular breaks, as you need to give your ear, go listen to something else, as you need to give your ears a bit of a reset, or you're going to run out of patience and you're going to become tone deaf and, you're not going to remember things very clearly. So we've got our correction EQ. The next step is compression. So compression, we'll just call this normal compressor. We're going to set a setting just so it doesn't sound like complete garbage as I explain this. A normal compressor, which is called a downward compressor if you want to get super specific, but the normal compressor is a tool that reduces the dynamic range. So that is the variance between the loudest possible point in your signal and the quietest possible point in the signal, and it reduces that by way of squishing the top part. So it doesn't really affect the quiet signals. What it does is it takes the loudest parts that you get above a certain threshold, which is a set volume level. Everything above a set volume level is going to get squished into itself and reduce the dynamics there so that it's a little bit more consistent. Because the issue you have when doing podcasts or live streams or whatever is most of your average talking, voices are about around here, whatever this range is for you. But then you have a lot of ups and downs. As you get quieter, you get excited, or blah, 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 and you have some variance there that becomes a little grating to listen to and a little harder to avoid, clips and peaks and distortion and things like that when you're game streaming or teaching or something. And so you want to keep that a little more controlled. And so the recommended settings for this kind of thing, in terms of ratio, typically the recommended settings for voiceover is 3:1 all the way up to 4 or 5:1 I've seen sometimes. Typically it's 4:1. I've been leaning more towards 3 to 5:1. What the ratio does is that is how much it is squishing that top part down. So if you are someone who gets much, much louder than your average talking point at, random, then you might want to squish that a little more. The more you squish it, the less range your voice will have, and the more broadcasty kind of podcast, I don't know, that radio sound where it all sounds the same temperature. It starts to sound a little monotonous. There's no variance to it or like energy to it or anything like that. The more you squish it, the more that sounds. So 3.5 to 4 is a little more gentle, a little more suited to the vocal range that provides that extra, compression that we need without getting too overdone. So that's typically what I recommend going with. The threshold is, again, the volume level at which once you get over top of it, the compressor starts activating. So you can look at ourselves here as we are talking. As we are talking, we are bumping, our average talking is still around -12. We could probably crank that gain up just a little bit here. Talking, but we get those peaks that go up really, really high. Those peaks are what we have to worry about because those peaks are going to be what we need to squish down. And so then we need to set our compressor threshold to activate above what our average talking point is. So here for us, it is looking to be around -15 to -16 still. Again, we could crank that gain up a little bit and adjust that. So now we're talking and our averages are, we're still just kind of peaking up there. We're going to really crank it now. I'm switching back to my non-processed audio for you to hear this, just so I don't clip your ears out. All right, now we're at about -9. So everything above -9, we want to squish into itself to reduce the range. If we want to sound more podcasty, we keep our gain down a little bit, so that way we only have to activate it above, say, -17 here. So I'm going to keep my gain about +12.4. We're going to set our compressor to activate at about -17. We're going to turn that on. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the actual loudness that our peaks end up at, which is going to bring us back down this way, despite the gain that we have up here, which is what the output gain is for. But first, we got to set attack and release. Attack and release is basically how quick, once you reach over that threshold, how quickly, as soon as you cross that -17.5 here, for example, threshold, it will start to compress your voice. You generally want this to be pretty fast because otherwise you could let a peak slip out, or you could end up being kind of like, whoa, as it tames you down, where if you keep it slow, like you'll be able to get really loud and then it brings you down, which could be interesting. Certain use cases have it, but for vocals, you want that to be really fast, but then you want your release set to something like 200 milliseconds because you want it to keep you compressed on that higher range for longer. So again, you don't just bounce back and forth like a sine wave. That would be really grating to listen to. So I recommend 2 to 5 milliseconds attack, 200-ish milliseconds release. And then for output gain, again, you're just trying to get yourself up in the red. I know a lot of people have been commenting, being like, you don't want to be in the red. Red is bad, blah, blah, blah. As long as you are below 0 dB, you are not clipping. And just because it's red doesn't mean it's set up the same way. If you max out at -6 dB, you are going to be quieter than every other stream and video on Twitch. And we're going to make sure that you never clip with another filter we're adding later in our chain. So for now, we are just going to crank that up. That's too much. See what I mean? If you're worried, if you're trying to listen to this in real time or you're worried about clipping, we're going to go ahead and add another filter in the chain. This is called a limiter. I'm going to click Add Limiter, and I'm going to set the threshold to about -1.5 dB. A limiter is effectively a compressor with an infinite ratio. So every time you cross the -1.6 dB threshold, basically every time you start to get too close to peaking, it is going to crush your audio down with the compressor by reducing the range, not by affecting quality or anything like that, to make sure you never clip and peak. And so again, we want to be around -2 dB-ish for our noise, for just our overall sound profile. So if we set us to -2 to -5 dB here in the limiter settings, then we are never going to cross that. And then you can play with the output gain to make sure you're not too quiet, but basically that you're ever so slightly bumping up against that limiter only when you really peak. So like my average talking right now is in that -5 range. But if I start to yell, you can see we're hitting that wall basically of -2 something dB. And that is what the limiter is serving for us. So we're still missing our second stage of EQ, which is going to add a little bit of flavor to our voice. So we're going to add another 3-band EQ. We're going to say flavor, and we want that before the limiter. The limiter is going to be the last thing in our chain pretty much no matter what in any audio processing chain, because it's the thing that just holds it all together. and order of operations is top to bottom, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. So limiter stays at the bottom. Now for our flavor EQ, I kind of need to take a sample here and see what I sound like for now. Okay, based on listening to our samples, we still have a little bit of nasally action going on, and we need to boost the highs a little bit to get a little bit of that clarity. So I'm going to cut the mids a little bit more. They just get kind of amplified through the nature of compression. And then we're going to boost the highs a little bit, which is going to take those higher frequencies that give us a little clarity and boost them to add a little spark to our voice. Again, ideally we'd have a parametric EQ that would look like this, and we'd be able to fine tune the specific frequencies and blah, blah, blah. We're working with just what's in OBS right now. So we're going to take the mids, drop them down a little bit more, take the highs, boost them a little bit, and I'm going to re-record my sample, see how I sound. Honestly, for just using a 3-band EQ, which I typically find very limiting, I'm pretty happy with how this sounds. I'm going to take my, actually I can just do an A/B test right now based on what I have in my 2 different OBS instances. This is what the microphone sounded like raw coming out of the microphone, and this is what it sounds like coming out of the audio processing. Not everyone's going to prefer it. You can tweak to your own heart's content and blah, blah, blah. But we made some good progress, and some of you commented on some of my more recent, budget microphone reviews, the difference that can be made. This is the process you would use to do it. Now, some of you are going to be asking, what about noise suppression? I have a lot of background noise in my space. How do I do that? You would add that, I would say first, but since we're adding so much gain, if you follow the steps in my previous video and how I laid it out here, we're going to add it after the gain step. So you would come in here, add a new filter. So there are 2 different types of noise removals. There's noise gate and noise suppression. Noise suppression is always running and trying to just remove whatever it thinks is background noise from your voice. This can be done a few different ways. It can affect the quality of your voice, but make sure that your voice, your audio is consistently without noise. A noise gate basically just turns off your microphone below a certain threshold. So if you have a very consistent background noise, like a computer fan, AC, or whatever, that's running at a very low volume, then it's only ever really going to be heard when you're talking, when it's much less noticeable, but it doesn't try to alter your voice to really remove it. It just shuts and closes based on when you talk. 2 completely different approaches, and some people use both. I will show you how to set both of them up here. So you click the plus in the filters. We're going to add a noise gate. I'm going to click OK. We're going to drag this back up again, right after gain. And then you have some thresholds here. You got to be careful. The open threshold needs to be set pretty low. You want it to be right above where your noise level is. For a lot of people, it's somewhere around -45 to -55 dB, and then the closed threshold is mostly going to be about the same. The issue you're going to run into is if you don't set this right, if you set this too aggressive, you're going to start chopping off your voice. Like if I crank this up right here and start, just kind of talking kind of quietly, you could end up just whacking off your voice. We're going to delete that. What if we want to do noise suppression and remove, existing noise from all of our audio instead of just opening and closing? We can add that. Again, drag it right up next to gain. And you have a couple different options. Speaks is the one that was built in to OBS in the first place, and it's just a specific noise suppression algorithm. You have a suppression level here that can work at different things, but it's very easy to run on lower end hardware, but it is pretty low quality. RN noise uses more CPU usage. You don't get a slider, but it is really freaking good. Like, I am not kidding that this noise removal is incredibly impressive for just a basic filter. Now, if you have the NVIDIA RTX 20 series, 30 series, or 40 series graphics cards, and you install the Audio Effects SDK, you can use the NVIDIA RTX voice background removal, the AI stuff that runs on your graphics card. And that can be enabled through this. Once you install those once you install the SDK, you can enable the noise removal, the room echo removal, which helps remove reverb if your voice is echoing around in your room, or both of them at the same time. And you do get a slider for that as well. And this is also very, very good and super impressive in many cases. But you want it in between your gain and your EQ. That's all good for vocals, but we haven't even touched the upward compressor. The upward compressor would be used for your game sound, for your background sound. I'm actually going to simulate this through a video. So I'm going to pull up a video of a game, and we are going to basically balance the audio with that using a couple different things. All right, so in this case, I have dragged on a video of Apex Legends, and the audio is playing. You can see it is very loud. I will go ahead and just fit the source to the screen, not that it matters for what we're looking at. And you can see here it's very, very loud. Now, again, I'll show the image on screen of where your game audio should live. The basic step would, of course, be to just drag that sucker down so you can actually hear what I'm talking about. I will have cut between those different tracks so you can see how obnoxious that is. But you're going to run into a couple problems. First and foremost, to keep it consistently quiet enough, you really got to crank it down to be where it's going to be really hard to hear. And the second is, as you keep it really quiet, your viewers are going to hear less and less, and the quieter parts, like footsteps and things like that, your viewers are just not going to hear at all. And so we're going to address both of those things. First and foremost, we're going to let you set your game audio a little louder, but have it decrease in volume as you start talking. This is called auto ducking, and it can be done with the side chaining capability of the compressor. So if we come back in here to your audio mixer and click filters on the game sound source, or your system sound, your music, whatever, we're going to click the three dots, go to filters. We're going to add a compressor. And under sidechain ducking source, we're going to choose your microphone. Now, this changes what things happen. So we're going to set our levels up a little louder here, so that the average game sound can be heard a lot more loudly. But then whenever your microphone reaches above a certain threshold, this threshold is now whenever your microphone, since we set the sidechain source as microphone, whenever your microphone hits that specific threshold, it's going to start squishing the game sound down. And so we can really crank this up if we want. And as we start talking, you can watch that game sound go down. And as we stop talking, it goes back up a little bit. And again, you want that fast attack and super slow release. Like, I would even make it a lot slower than the normal one. That way it's not just bouncing up and down in between words and things like that. Look at that get really loud. That's a little too loud. We could either decrease that with the fader here in the mixer like we were doing, or turn it down with the output gain here to like -8. We got to restart our video. So now we're talking. You can see it's really, really quiet. Now it's pretty loud, but now we're talking. It's quiet again.
I love going inside.
And you got to adjust your threshold so it's not super jarring, but you get the idea there. Now that's the basic step, the side chaining, the auto ducking. I've made a couple dedicated tutorials on it. If you want a more in-depth look at that specific feature, I'll have them linked below. But then we also have the upward compressor. This works in the opposite of how we applied the compressor to our microphone, where when we applied it to our microphone, we wanted all of our peaks and the super loud points to be squished down so that we had a more consistent signal. With this, we are actually squishing down the quieter parts and squishing them up into the mid-range of your audio so that footsteps or small, sound details in your game can still be heard by your viewers. Or this also can apply to music as well, less ideal for talking scenarios. But those kinds of things where you want those quieter details that you're kind of squishing away to come back a little bit into your mix. So we're going to add a filter again, upward compressor, click OK, and you probably want this to be before your standard compressor because you don't want it to negatively affect the levels you already kind of perfectly set here. So now we have the same set of controls with the upward compressor, more or less. You've got ratio, threshold, attack, release, and output gain. We don't want to touch output gain because we're managing that elsewhere. But with ratio and threshold, basically, it's the inverse. So instead of whenever something gets louder than this threshold, it's whenever something gets quieter than this threshold. So we want it set pretty quiet. Whenever something is quieter than, say, -45, because we can see here our averages are around here for the most part. When anything's quieter than -45, we want to really crank it up like that. We want a decent attack and probably that same release. And again, we probably don't want anything like this. I'm going to stop and listen to the sample before and after and see if it made a difference. This is a sample with no processing filters, just the game sound dropped down to -14.6 dB. This is talking while gaming. You can see here the game is pretty quiet, but it doesn't adjust when we stop talking. We stop talking, the game stays pretty quiet. You can't necessarily hear all the details, all that jazz. Now we have the game sound set to -5 dB, but we have the compressor sidechain auto ducking setup as well as the upward compressor. So when we stop talking, it's automatically adjusting, but it's also keeping fairly quiet below our talking voice otherwise. Test, test, 1, 2, 3, test, test. Combine this with all the other principles I teach you in the other 2 episodes, which you should click and watch right now, and you can create the perfect stream audio mix right inside of OBS Studio. Hope you enjoyed. Be sure to click these 2 videos to continue learning your audio mastering journey. You're really missing out if you don't miss those, and otherwise you can click right here to watch my next video early, exclusively on my own video site, Nebula. Remember to be kind, rewind.